Good day. I welcome you to this SAIA event launching a special issue of the South African Journal of International Affairs. I'm Martha Bridgman, the editor of that journal, and joining us today are one of the guest editors and various authors, as well as the chief executive and editor-in-chief of SAIA and of the journal, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. So I will be making an introduction in a moment, just a few housekeeping issues. One is that there will be time for question and answers, and we will welcome those after all the panelists have had an opportunity to present their interventions. There will be two discussants following three of the authors, a guest editor who's also an author, and then I would ask that you type your questions in the Q&A function or through the chat box that you can bring up on your Zoom. I would like to also note that we have a survey form that we ask you to complete after the speakers are finished, if you are willing. That will be shared also via the chat function, and we would greatly appreciate feedback on the event today. The event is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. There will be an opportunity to share that recording should you think somebody would like to hear it. And on that note, I will introduce Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, who is our chief executive at SAIA. I think the most, her involvement with this issue of the just energy transition and climate change in general has been long through, especially our climate and natural resource program, as it is currently called. And so we have an active research program at SAIA in this area. Today's special issue is specifically looking at the energy transition and green mineral value chains, and challenges and opportunities for Africa and Latin America. Elizabeth was part of the early discussions establishing this special issue, and she will give us an idea of SAIA's work in this and also of her, her take on the special issue. I would like to just note she has just returned from the T20 most recent meeting. That's the G20 sort of think tank network. And she is a co-chair of that, I believe, from India. And so she's got her finger on the pulse on a lot of these issues. She is also part of the United Nations I'm going to have to read it. What it is, it's the UN High Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs. She has been on that body through the United Nations for a few years, and so again, finger on the pulse. So Elizabeth, thank you for your joining us today. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Martha, and welcome to everybody. Welcome in particular to our contributors to the special issue, both the editors and the authors at large. So to speak. You alluded a little bit, Martha, to the genesis of the special issue, and the genesis sort of goes even further back than when we thought about doing it in the journal. I think Melanie Miller, one of the editors of the special issue, approached us to work together on a joint proposal on related issues. Sadly, we didn't get that proposal, Melanie, but we're still holding out. But the topic, was absolutely critical. This is it. We started this conversation. I think probably it must be now nearly 2 years ago, Melanie, or yeah. And I think the topic has become even more important rather than less important. And of course, it's also been caught up in the broader geopolitical context and contestation. So we're really very pleased that we could partner, that SAIA could partner and the journal could partner with SWP, which I can do in German, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And also with with also some South African colleagues that I haven't seen in some time, and I'm very pleased could collaborate. Faisal Ismail from the Nelson Mandela School. It's really great that you could also participate in this project. I think a very special thank you in the first instance to Martha Bridgman, Dr. Bridgman, and then of course to our three guest editors, Dr. Miller, Melanie Miller, Micah Schulze, and Svenja Schoeneich. So pronunciation from SWP. I think maybe just a couple of observations, because before I hand over to the real experts on this issue, I think South Africa has just completed the hosting of the BRICS, of the 15th BRICS summit, and certainly one of its themes, one of its priorities that it had set out for its chairmanship is obviously the just energy transition. One can understand that, both in the context of our current challenges, but also in the broader context of the impact on jobs and so on, and of course in terms of our carbon footprint. It was really interesting to note, quite a few paragraphs in the Joburg Declaration referring to energy, to the just transition, and of course during the course of the last week, with the visit, also the state visit preceding the BRICS summit of the Chinese President Xi Jinping, a number of agreements and discussions around helping us with our power constraints, but also some financing for our transition. This is, of course, a much broader issue, which the Institute has been doing quite a bit of work on. More of that will be conveyed to you by my two colleagues who are also respondents. But of course, the just energy transition in the South African and in the broader global South context is increasingly on the agenda. It's increasingly it's part of the conversations that are happening in the G20. It is core to any conversation, I think, in the developing world about how we move from where we are now to a greener future. But it also sort of plays out in the context of the conversations about access to natural resources and to the critical minerals that are required for the technological transition. And here, certainly talking about it in Africa, from an African perspective, but also from a Latin American perspective, two continents that have significant reserves, we certainly don't want at a political and a geopolitical level to see the repetition of previous rushes to access resources without actually our countries, global South, being able to move up the value chain and being able to benefit from supply chains, value chains in managing the transition in our energy systems. So that, I think, will sit as the big elephant in the room in many of these conversations, and my colleagues will also be talking a little bit more about some of the work we're actually doing in that area on the continent. But let me stop there. I'm clearly not the person you're here to listen to. I look forward to the presentations and to the conversations, and thank you all for joining us in this very important discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I have every confidence that it will be a worthwhile time. So thank you very much for those good words of introduction. I will hand over now to Melanie, Dr. Muller, who is, Elizabeth gave us the German version. Can I give the English version? With the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, where she is a senior associate and has been very focused on matters in Africa and on climate. So I would like to note that she is actually an author on 2 papers, the introduction with her co-guest editors, and then the paper on the geopolitics that's driving the, well, that is part of the picture behind new discussions on these value chains. So with that, I would like to just hand over to Melanie and allow you to tell us about the special issue.
Yes, thank you very much, Martha. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for a great introduction, as always, with perfect German pronunciation. I'm very happy that we can hold this event today, and I think it is really right. You know, it comes right at, or it comes at the right time. And I think it was even 2.5 years ago when we developed that proposal. And I really feel that we were a bit early, because during that time, this discussion hadn't really been, you know, taken up. But I think since, I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was the latest moment, I think, when people realized that this is a really big issue. In Europe, I think a bit more because of China's role, because China has a, you know, many European countries are very dependent on imports of raw materials from China because they're processed there. But I think a lot has changed in the past year. And I'm also pretty sure that if we would like send out our call for papers today, we would probably receive more contributions. I'm very happy that we received so many interesting contributions, but I think a lot has changed in the past year. And when you look at the agenda of the African Union, the African Development Bank is working on a green mineral strategy. There are various African countries and also Latin American countries who came forward with new mineral strategies, refusing to export minerals that are not ongoing issue. And I hope my connection is stable, because this tells me, yeah, perfect. So is it okay? Okay. The focus of our journal is the green energy transition and mineral value chains. So we look at 2 transitions, I think, and what people have called a double transition. The first one is the shift from a fossil fuel-based energy model to a renewable energy model. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
can.
Okay. Perfect. Sorry, I was just really getting messages here, but that sounds good. Okay. The green energy transition, like I said, a shift from a fossil fuel-based resource model to a renewable model, which does not necessarily mean to move away from coal-based production to solar power or wind power, but it also requires different resources. And it means a shift for certain countries from fossil fuels, coal, but also oil and gas, to the extraction of minerals. And this particularly affects countries in the global south. And this is where I would like to share a few slides. So I hope you can see this. Because when we, okay.
We can see it.
Yeah. Because when we look at the different stages of metal supply chains, we have the first stage, which is extraction, and also ore dressing, which happens close to extraction normally. Then we have the second stage of smelting and refining, which is necessary before ores and minerals can go to industrial processing and the finishing of products, and eventually to recycling. But I think if we look at this, there's this technical structure, but there is also a geopolitical structure. And I think it's really interesting to look at this slide as well, where we see national and regional shares of extraction, refining, and manufacturing for selected metals. So this is a slide that only looks at 6 base metals, but I would say on the average, this is how the geopolitical structure of mineral supply chains looks like. So as you can see, we have extraction mainly happening in areas other than the EU, the United States, and also China. So a bit more extraction happening in China, but what you see in gray here, over 70%, is happening in the so-called global South, in Africa, Latin America, and also other Asian countries, where China is the most important actor. So China has massively invested in the refining and smelting industry, build up smelters and refineries in the country. So that means, and I think this is where you also get to understand the Belt and Road, the connectivity strategy of China. So many of the resources that are extracted at the first stage are going to China, are being refined. Not so much happening in Europe, also not much happening in the US. And from there, these refined material, it looks different again. Still, China playing an important role, but this is because of the selected metals. Aluminium production is happening in China. It's quite important. But as you can see, the European Union, the US, so this is where we can see countries in the global South don't play a big role. And this brings me also to my last slide. And this is where you can see what has changed in the past 20 years. Especially when you look at smelting and refining from 2002 to 2018, China, as I said, has massively invested and has built up smelting and refining capacities and has moved from 17, almost 18% of global refining and smelting production to 44.5%. So it almost accounts for half of the processing of these selected metals that happens worldwide. So I think this is a very interesting development. And for many countries in Africa and also in Latin America, the question is how to get there, because as we all know, the biggest sustainability and also human rights risks happen at the stage of ore extraction. And this is a highly mechanized area, and to build up value and local content in the supply chains, it doesn't happen at the extraction phase, but more when you move into the further production, not only smelting and refining, but maybe also producing certain components, for example, for electric vehicles, something that has currently been discussed in certain countries in Southern Africa. I'm pretty sure we will hear a bit more about that. So our idea was to investigate current policies, but also discussions in Africa and also because the point is that with the Paris Climate Agreement, these countries have also agreed to reduce their CO2 emissions. So there is a requirement to move away from fossil fuels energy to renewable energies. But then we have these geopolitical changes and dynamics, which also puts a lot of pressure on extracting more minerals and metals. But it also offers a window of opportunity because many countries are now in a position where they can choose with whom they want to partner. This is, I think, the probably a positive aspect of the current geopolitical climate, that it opens up windows of opportunities, and countries can use their bargaining power to see who comes with the best offers. Our idea was to really shed some light on perspectives of countries in the global south, because I think so far this transition has been driven mainly by actors in the global north. And also when you look at the global discussion around these topics, the perspectives and the interests of countries in the global south are very often neglected. So the idea was to specifically focus on that. And I'm very happy, and I think so are Maike and Svenja, who are also joining our webinar today, who are my co-editors of the journal, that we had 7 contributions to the special issue. I think Faisal and Jan, I will introduce them shortly, will present their cases as well, but I'll just give you a short overview about the topics. So the first article is a contribution by myself, which is looking at opportunities for mineral-rich countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I exactly wanted to look at how these changing dynamics within the EU, but also in the US, could offer windows of opportunities for African countries, but also what that means for sustainability in supply chains. Then we had a contribution from Christopher Van Dome, who is looking at Zambia, demonstrating how the Hichilema government managed to balance tensions between the international and local priorities concerning international investment for national benefits. So it's an interesting article that is also looking at Zambia's economic diplomacy and the development of a holistic policy strategy. Then we have 2 contributions on South Africa. Salim Fakir from the African Climate Foundation, he contributed an essay where he looks at South Africa's just energy transition as one example of an African approach towards a sustainable energy transition. And then we had a team around Chris Cheddi, who was also looking at the South African Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. It's a very long name, REIPPP. And they show what is needed to make wind farms work according to the principles of just transition. Faisal Ismail is also focusing on South Africa. I will tell you a bit more shortly. And then we had 2 articles on Latin America. One from Pedro Alajon and another one from Jan Ikla, who will also speak about his contribution. And they both looked at the challenges and opportunity of the just energy transition for Latin America. Pedro Alajon shows how in South American states such as Ecuador and Colombia, a global energy transition requires the breaking of new ground, including technological innovation and an improved cooperation between the global north and the global south. And Jan Ikla, whom I also introduce shortly, takes a closer look at Ecuador's energy policies and its development strategy. So I think these are very, at the one hand, different countries and regions, but on the other hand, I think in many areas comparable. So I'm very happy that we can welcome Faisal and Jan with 2 contributions from different regions. And I really hope that this will open up a conversation with you, with the audience. I can see we have almost 74 people in the audience and the conversation, and also bringing in your perspectives later. Before I'm going to introduce Jan and Faisal, I really wanted to thank Martha Bridgman again. I think this was a really great cooperation. We had many things to discuss in the past year, and I think it was really worth it. I'm very happy about the special issue. And also a great thanks to Saya and the valuable exchanges that we had in the past years, I have to say. I was also able to spend a bit of time with Saya in March, which was also a great experience for me to understand also the policy dimension that you require. And I think this is maybe what what is a good collaboration between SWP and SIAD, that we first of all we conduct our own research, but at the same time we also aim at influencing policymakers and other decision makers and think about how this research can inform policy decisions. I think I will, Martha, yeah.
Yes, thank you for those good words. If you would like to introduce our panelists, then we'll start the panel. That'd be great.
Perfect, yes, we'll do that. Yes, I'm very happy that Faisal Ismail is going to join us today, or is joining us today. He is the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. He has served as the ambassador of South Africa to the World Trade Organization, so he also has a lot of practical experiences. And he teaches international trade and global governance at the University of Cape Town, where the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance is also located, and in the Graduate School of Business. He is author of 3 books on the WTO and also a recent book on the African continental free trade area. And he's published over 50 journal articles, book chapters, and working papers on trade and economic development. In his paper, he argues that a policy focus on the just energy transition is insufficient to tackle climate change. He offers a better concept by climate resilient development, which broadens the view by including adaptation and resilience. And Faisal is going to show us in his presentation what this can mean for the implementation of the just energy transition or new technologies for Southern Africa. And hi, Faisal, I'm glad that you're joining. And I would also like to welcome Jan Ikla. He's a researcher and PhD candidate at the University of Kassel, where he's been a coordinator at the Center for Advanced Latin American Studies. His research focuses on the relationship between economic elites and resource-driven development in Latin America, especially in Ecuador. Like I said, he contributed an article on Ecuador. And his research areas include social inequalities, resource policy, and development theory. And he edited, together with Dr. Hannes Warnecke-Berger, a book which was just released, The Political Economy of Extractivism and the Seduction of Rent. Jan provides a closer look at Ecuador's energy policies and its development strategy based on extraction and export of raw materials. He describes how rent dependence functions as a resource-driven development model in Ecuador, where despite the sustainability concept becoming more prominent within national strategy, the entrenched driver of rent remains a formative power. A discourse that is also echoed in many other Latin American countries. So I think there is a broader regional discussion that we're also very much interested to hear more about. Faisal, we will start with you. We will start with Southern Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much to you, Melanie, for encouraging me really to write the paper. I was under pressure, but I was pleased to do it. I want to first make some disclaimers. Firstly, I'm not an expert at all on the subject of climate change or the just transition, and I haven't actually participated in any of the negotiations in the UNFCCC. Although, as you said, on trade and the WTO, I have done a few things in my life, and I am currently involved closely with the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. But again, the Secretariat and the AFCFTA, they haven't really begun to grapple with this question. of either climate change and trade, or the debate about critical minerals. So it's so for me, the paper was really a thought piece. It was a brainstorm with myself, and it was engaging with the substance, the debate. So thanks to you, Melanie, for introducing me to some of the literature, and also for inviting me to the brainstorming session in Berlin, hosted by the SWP, because that also made me think a bit about this paper. So in a sense, this paper is a work in progress. Actually, I had to read it quickly just before this meeting, and I found so many errors. And actually, I would rewrite it quite differently now. So it is work in progress, but also things have changed already since the paper was written. They have progressed, but I'm pleased to say that I think the direction of my own work here is, flowing in the same direction as events, as the events have unfolded, and the debate, both in various fora around the world, including in the UNFCCC, where there is now actually a working group established to discuss the just transition. So that was my starting point in this paper. I was really trying to engage with this concept of the just transition, because at first it sounds good, but when you read it carefully, when you think about it, and when you see how it is applied, you see that actually it could also be used by those interest groups that don't really want meaningful and transformative change, but really want the status quo to remain, and to actually use it in a way which is incremental, project-oriented, and does some good, but actually doesn't really change the fundamental structures. And I will certainly look at Jan's work on Ecuador, but it certainly won't do what needs to be done in Ecuador, which is to transform the economy. So that's why I was instinctively critical of the concept. But after the sort of last year or so's events, I'm even more critical of it. But in my reading of the literature, particularly in the IPCC, the last report, I did find other researchers with whom I connected. And there were some researchers who began to think about the just transition in a more transformative way. And they actually created the concept of climate resilient development. They argued that, the just transition, tended to focus more on mitigation and the transition from, high carbon emitting energy towards lower carbon, but it doesn't really include adaptation and resilience. And, what became very important the last couple of years was loss and damage, which was, the immediate concerns of countries impacted by the negative impacts of climate change. So these things are not really part of the just transition. And when you really look carefully at so why the just transition? It became topical because of South Africa, and great work to the South African negotiators. They raised it in Glasgow, and they actually got a win. They argue anyway. The negotiators, I think they did. They moved the debate. They did get some traction. They got some support. But actually, when you look at it carefully, you see that the money was really directed mostly at the transition on energy. It doesn't grapple with the fundamental systemic nature of climate change and its impacts on our economies, our society, and the social structure of particularly in developing countries. So that's why I thought really what we should do is we should broaden the discussion, from just transition, or at least we should incorporate in the just transition framework something bigger, which grapples with the more fundamental systemic transformations which are required. Now, so that's my first point. Now, second point, I liked, Melanie, your contribution is really great. Coming from the North, I appreciate it a lot because you really are looking at, you know, the geopolitics are real. So the numbers you put there, China and all that, that speaks to the, you know, reality that there is a geopolitical crisis, or, you know, something that's not so new that we know, which is competitiveness between, you know, nations, which is driving this agenda on transformation, rather than, you know, a real commitment to sustainability and inclusiveness. And but there is an opportunity here, as you say, for particularly for developing countries in Africa and Latin America. I'm glad you bring in Latin America and some parts of Asia, which are way behind, which are on the sort of those countries that are marginalized from the world economy, and who now stand to either benefit from the transition or for their current structure to be reinforced. Like, you know, Ecuador could remain like it is. It could give all its minerals away, but still remain poor at the end. And that could be the case for most of sub-Saharan African countries who are basically commodity exporters. But you see there's an opportunity, and I agree with you. So I agree that we should look at this as an opportunity to transform. But to do that, we need agency. We need African countries to lead, to take responsibility. So I say the first thing they should do is mainstream this concept of climate resilient development, which means they must accept that climate change is here, and to address it fully, we have to make a transformative change, and that means, you know, across the board, not just mitigation, but also deal with adaptation issues and resilience, and build that into our national development strategies. And therefore, I say mainstream it. That means greater coordination at the national level and coherence between government departments, because we tend to, you know, relegate the whole climate issue to the environment department, which in most cases, they're the least powerful, you know, department in the whole government. So they can't lead, you know, you have to get everybody else. You have to bring the finance guys in, you know, tend to be more powerful, and the trade and industry people and all that into, and the energy department. And so that's what I say. That's my first point. And I think that, so drawing on the South African experience, because I think it's good experience, South Africa has also done a few good things. They have tried to develop a strategy, an investment strategy, but I think it is not fully baked yet. They need to broaden it and deepen it to incorporate other issues. But they can, and, you know, you see that in SAREM, in the South African Renewables Energy, you know, strategy, master plan strategy they have now. And I argue that they can play a role, South Africa, in the regional context, because this, you know, potential and opportunity is one which can be extended across the continent. Like in Latin America, you use the strengths of different countries. You can build value chains on critical minerals. So the, you know, the value chain you drew there about extraction and processing and refining and all of that, you can do that across the continent. You can also build, you know, power pools across the continent, so that you use the different energy capabilities of the continent. And we have plenty of energy, alternative energy sources, both in Latin America, in Africa too. And we can build cooperation programs, we can build power pools, transmission lines which run across the continent. So that's the potential. And what's the opportunity? The opportunity is that we now have in Africa, unlike Latin America, in Africa, we're much more organized. Actually, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which now creates the possibility to negotiate continental agreements. So we can create a political framework. You can create the institutional framework. You can create the opportunity for countries to begin to negotiate bargains across, and to then build what I call developmental regionalism. So, and I say, well, you can expand this to bring in the energy or the climate change impacts, and you can build something what I call climate resilient developmental regionalism. So that means really integrating climate change response into our regional integration program. So that's my second point. My third point is about global governance. So what we see is in the world, many countries are acting in the north to address climate change, but they're doing it in a way which is going to hurt developing countries. So the example I take is of CBAM. It's a measure, a trade measure to address their own problems at home, but the impact of that is going to be negative for other developing countries. But I critique it, it can be critiqued legally from a WTO point of view, but, just from a political point of view and a process point of view, it's unilateral. There's no transparency, there was no consultation, and, it's unfair, it's inequitable. It flies against all the principles of special and differential treatment or common and differential responsibility, all of that. It doesn't really accord with that. So I say what we have here is the need for global coherence in global governance, right? Between the WTO, which I know a little bit about, and the UNFCCC, which is actually discussing a lot of these issues, but hasn't had power, doesn't have authority to negotiate deals which are binding. And, most of the guys there say, no, we can't discuss anything which has a trade implication because, the trade ministers are not here. And we can't discuss anything with the finance implication, the finance ministers are not here. So the really important issues are not discussed in the UNFCCC. They're discussed elsewhere. So we need global coherence between, environment ministers, trade ministers, and finance ministers, and we need this to be come together. So this takes me to the final point, which is where we go next. So luckily for us, in between the last 6 months, there was a big discussion about finance and the need to change the whole architecture of global finance to make a meaningful contribution to not just transition, in the narrow sense, but to climate resilient development in the broader sense, because who's going to deal with adaptation and resilience and loss of and damage, because that's real for a lot of small countries. So we need a bigger, envelope, or we need a much bigger response on finance and climate finance. It can't happen unless, we increase the ambition and we bring all these very powerful ministers together. And that can only happen at the global level. So we need to bring the United Nations, as a whole. And so there is a discussion on SDG and the midterm of the 2030 agenda right now in New York. And that's where the debate should be, but the US, I think, doesn't want to discuss it in that meeting. But really going forward, this is where it must happen. The UN has to bring all these agencies together, and we have to discuss, a much more ambitious agenda. So anyway, that was my conclusion in this paper. But as I said, it's work in progress. If I have to rewrite it now, I'll start with the just transition and the new working group that was established in the UNFCCC. But thank you very much for getting me started.
Thank you. Well done. Spot on with time. So over to Jan Ickler, who will address us regarding his paper.
Yeah, thanks so much. Before I begin, I want to thank you all for making this possible. First of all, to Melanie, Maike, and Svenja for putting this special issue together. Then, of course, to Saya and Martha and the staff for all the help and the good comments. I'm really happy to be here, and of course to you all for listening and being here on this webinar. My paper is titled Green Energy Transitions and the Temptation of Natural Resource Rents, Experience from Ecuador. And as Melanie has said, I have more focus on Latin America, of course, and on political economy. And the paper is interested in extractivism, as we call it in Latin America, as a development model. So a development model that is built on the extraction and export of natural resources. And I try to, in this paper, I try to link different international and local and domestic factors together to explain what structural features enable or might enable, shape, limit, or block the scopes or the practice of energy transitions in my case, which is Ecuador. And I want to, in this presentation, I want to do three things. I want to first talk a little bit about theory, where I'm coming from and how I perceive the academic literature on the topic. Maybe also interesting for you to see how these cases are or how these theories are debated in Latin America. And then I want to introduce or put some time into introducing the case and Latin America, because I might feel that you're not all engaged so much in Latin America and Latin American politics in the last years. And then I want to come to my conclusions in the paper. But first, I want to present my theoretical perspective. As I see the literature on extractivism, but also on the energy transition, the just energy transition or the green energy transition, there is a focus, and rightly so, on institutions. We have like an institutionalist approach, talking about different connections, different organizations, meetings, the way we introduce policies, the way we shape institutions that are facilitating structural change or the change towards a more sustainable world. This also connects to the idea of path dependency and is done so in the institutionalist literature very well. I come from a political economy background, so I would rather look into the structure of the world market and how it changes over time, and how different countries and different lock-ins into different development policies and development strategies happen over time. And I also look on to the national political configurations. Especially in this paper, I look onto the political constellation in Ecuador, how the domestic sphere shapes the scope of possible energy transitions. And I think this is important to have this domestic political and economic structure in mind, because as a policymaker, as organizations, but also as academics, there might be something to get from this. And in this paper, I try to combine these different outlooks, and I want to focus, or I focused on also the contestation of extractivism in Ecuador. So the different constellations of actors that are engaged in this development model, the different contestations by different strata of the society, how they're integrated in this development model, and what this basically means or could mean for Ecuador in the years coming. I do this integration of different perspectives by using a pretty old theory, development theory, that is focused on the concept of rent or natural resource rents. Originally, this is a concept stemming from the MENA region, from the Middle East. And rent theory, natural resource rents, is for me a form of economic surplus that stems from the political monopoly over natural resources. Natural resource rents is an income of the state, appropriated by the state by the means of export taxes or other instruments. And the interesting thing about rents is that they can be used freely. There is no need to reinvest rents into new factories or whatever, like it is with different surplus forms, but it's free capacity of the state. The state can choose whatever it wants to do with that. And this created basically the idea of development policies, of active industrial development. So the state can use the rents to do whatever it wants, and establish new industry paths, investing in sustainable development, or use it for social and political means, social reforms, health policies, education, whatever. And this is, of course, it's not only the state. The state consists of different groups. And I think this makes this theory so interesting because in the rent theory, basically what we assume is that different groups, societal groups, political groups, they form around the stream of rents. And they form around the state as an institution that offers them to extract the rent from the natural resources. So we have a specific political constellation that is brought about in which different actors cluster around rent streams, the extraction and the export of natural resources. And of course, it creates incentives for firms, but also for politicians to use the rent for whatever means. So we have the rent-seeking debate, we have the resource curse debate, which is long going. But my argument would be that it's also creating a social structure. So rent basically has a formative power in these societies, where the material reproduction of these societies depends on the rents. And it even has an international dimension because the rents are basically realized on the world market, because it's the world market demand for natural resources, which basically enables the possibility to extract rents by the state. So what I do in the paper is basically using this rent theory and the idea of rents to follow the proceedings and the events in Ecuador. And I focus on the different coalitions that form around the rent. So mainly the government, but also the target groups in Ecuador. I will talk about this. Those groups that receive parts of the rents that are extracted by the Ecuadorian state. Okay, so not all of you may be familiar with Latin America and Latin American politics regarding green energy transitions and natural resource development. I would say that in South America, there is the majority of countries that export natural resources. There is, of course, the most common case of Venezuela, which is basically dependent on oil exports, Ecuador as well on oil, but there's also Argentina, Brazil, the so-called Cono Sur, which exports soy, for example, or agricultural products. And they all in 2000s, with the upcoming of new middle-left governments, try to use these rents, these natural resource rents, for social democratic policies. They use the rent for industrial policies. They try to do upgrading in their own countries to change the way their value chains are institutionalized, but they also use it to subsidize industry. They use it for investing in education and social protectionist measures. All these governments were relatively successful in diminishing poverty and social inequality. But there's also been a crisis after the so-called commodity boom. The world market price is high from 2002 to 2003 to 2009, mainly driven by the Chinese demand. The prices for world market prices for Latin American products fell, and this whole constellation came into crisis because the rents basically diminished. And this also has political consequences. And in my case, in the case of Ecuador, I traced these consequences and tried to connect it to energy transitions and the possible outlooks that are there. And basically, I have to check how much time I got left. Okay, 5 minutes. The case of Ecuador is interesting, and it became more interesting in the last weeks because, first of all, Ecuador has been a long-time supplier of natural resources. First, it has been cacao and bananas, and then in the 70s, they found oil in the ground. And ever since, oil became the most important export product. Nearly 90% of prices of Ecuadorian exports are crude oil. And of course, this has been a possibility for different governments to use these rents to do development or other stuff. This is why it's interesting, and it's also interesting because right now, as the oil begin to play it's not playing a major role when the prices fell. The minerals like especially copper, but also gold, became more important, and Ecuador tried to basically balance out the losses they had from the oil prices with mining. So mining becomes more interesting. At the same time, Ecuador is one of the most biodiverse regions or countries in the world. There's the Amazonian rainforest, there's Galapagos, there are a lot of different species, and it's home to a lot of indigenous communities. And they basically, together with environmentalists, they always put pressure on the political system for using oil drilling or now mining for political gains. So it's a highly contested extractivist society. And I think this is interesting because in 2 weeks ago, there were elections in Ecuador. And after a long struggle, the populace basically voted for blocking mining in the Andean region and stopping oil drilling in a national park in the Amazonas. So although oil and mining right now plays an important role in the Ecuadorian economy, there is contestation from below. And you see that this contestation also plays out on the political field because different presidential candidates had to align with these groups. And I trace in Ecuador, and the time frame I've analyzed is from 2007 to 2019, which is exactly the period of the left-wing government under Rafael Correa. I traced like the different actors and groups, how they align to these problems, and how the diminishing of rent after 2013, when the prices fell, basically put not only the whole model, but also the development coalition, the government coalition in jeopardy. And that all the great parts of the Ecuadorian society and the political system demand the rent to function. And this exactly is the case where indigenous groups, indigenous movements have been pressured and where there's sometimes violence took place, and where the different sources of rents that the Ecuadorian state could perceive, mining, became more important. So you see that rent in this, or the natural resource rents in this case, are seductive, and they shape the outcome, or they shape the structures and the political alliances, as well as the cleavages in these countries. And I think it's important to have this in mind, that on the one hand, there is an international, transnational even movement that can bring things on the table. And in Ecuador, you see it in the indigenous movements and the environmentalist movements. And they, in a way, they have the power, or some power, to change government decisions and government discourses. But on the other hand, you have a reinforced, from the world market, reinforced structure, economic structure, that is important to have in mind, because it actually, through different loops, is defining how different strata of society reproduce materially. It's not only the extraction firms and the big mining corporations, but also the people in the big cities in Ecuador that profited from the rent streams that were distributed by the government. And this altogether is important because it basically shapes the outlook of a possible energy transition. I have not talked a lot about the energy transition in Ecuador, but I can do that if you want to. We can share comments, and I can answer that in the discussion. Yeah, time's over.
Excellent.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yes, well done. Thank you, Jan, for that presentation. I found the paper a very worthwhile read, so I would encourage you, and we are busy posting the links in the chat box. I will see if that one is posted. If not, we will do it shortly. Yes, we has posted it, my assistant editor. Thank you. Okay, we are now able to, before question and answer from the general participant group, and we do have a few more authors and guest editors in our participant list who would also be available to answer some questions. So if you have noted the papers in the issue, we did post the link, and hopefully you will have visited that issue on the Taylor and Francis site. Then I would encourage you to ask questions on Zambia. Chris Van Dome is with us, and also two guest editors, and Melanie will be able to moderate that because she knows more about their areas of expertise. In the meantime, Alex Benkenstein, who is the director of SAIA's program on natural resources, has agreed to be a respondent to the papers, as well as Dian Kluti, who is the director of our Futures program at SAIA. So I will hand over to these two gentlemen, and they can give us some comments on the papers.
Thank you. I'm going to keep my responses quite brief. Thanks for this opportunity. Well done to Melanie and the authors and the entire team. This was quite a process. And also, I think, as we heard from Faisal, the complexities of writing on a topic and an issue that is extremely timely, but also very rapidly developing. So I think that context is very important. And I think even just from the comments we heard from Faisal around the contestation about the very idea of a just transition and a Southern or an African conception of what a just transition means, I think is critical. Fortunately, I think we've seen, certainly in the Africa region, I don't know if pushback is maybe too strong a word, but certainly a critical engagement with the way the just transition is framed and how partnerships are built around that. Certainly, if one looks at some of the statements that came out in the lead up to last year's COP, messages from energy ministers, discussions around the role also of natural resources, including fossil fuel resources, in the continent's development. For those of you not aware of it, we did see last year the adoption of the first African regional climate change strategy, and that refers very explicitly to an African climate change and resilient development. That idea of a climate resilient development really comes at the center of this thinking and engagement. And I think we're going to see those debates continue. I also found Jan's comments and paper extremely insightful. Of course, those parallels between Latin America and Africa in terms of the position within global supply chains, largely as a supplier of unprocessed raw materials, but also very important, the link that he makes between ecosystems, health and biodiversity, and the trade-off and contestation that happens in this space is certainly something we're seeing reflected on the continent as well. I mean, for me, really, it helps to just return to the very basic starting points, and Melanie gave us some sense of that, is that the reality is the absolute dominance of China currently in minerals processing and manufacturing of green tech broadly. You see that in solar panels, you see that in batteries, really, across what we would think of as green tech industries. The other part of this reality that we're facing is that it is a matter of stated policy with the EU's Green Deal and with a critical mineral strategy that came out earlier this year, the US's Inflation and Reduction Act. They also had an American Battery Materials Initiative launched last year. It's explicit policy that the EU and the US wants to address this dominance of China. And yes, there is language about saying this is not about kind of isolating China or moving entirely away from China, but it does talk about diversifying supply chains. The reality is that many of these minerals and large reserves of these minerals are found on the continent. So, you know, if we're just following what the policies explicitly state, it means that, you know, the game is going to change in terms of Africa's position. We also know that the Africa region has been very explicit around seeking a more direct relationship between the exploitation of its mineral resources and development, but also industrialization, also processing, moving up the value chain. This has been part of the African mining vision since back in 2009, and that's still very relevant. I'm not sure if everyone here in this group would be aware that the African Development Bank, in partnership with other regional institutions, is also working on an African critical minerals, what they tend to use the frame green minerals strategy. There's already a response paper or a position paper that is available online, I think, which gives some sense of where the thinking is going. The African Mineral Development Center, which is a specialized agency of the African Union Commission dealing with all issues around mining governance, and also, again, those linkages with industrialization, have been very active in this space. And SAIA has also been very fortunate to be able to collaborate with them. There's a few projects underway. Dion will probably touch on some of those. In fact, SAIA is working currently with the African Mineral Development Center around an African Critical Minerals Observatory, just recognizing that there's such a need to map and keep an eye on not only where these resources are, but the investments taking place, the initiatives and commitments that are being launched around minerals processing and value addition. Maybe the leading example of that is the Mineral Security Partnership, which is widely seen as a US-led initiative, but includes the EU and other partners. Even India is now part of the Mineral Security Initiative. And this is presented to the continent as a new kind of engagement, a new kind of deal that is not interested in purely just extracting these resources, but wants to meet the continent halfway in terms of this narrative around creating jobs, linking to green industrialization, minerals processing, and green tech. But we've got to look at these very carefully and see what the results really are looking on down the road. I've mentioned this example in a few other forums, but one of the first initiatives that was launched or announced under the Mineral Security Partnership was, in fact, US funding to an Australian company that was mining graphite in Mozambique. And that funding went towards building a processing plant for those minerals in the US. So, you know, when you look at the realities on the ground, you've really got to look at these things carefully and say, is the narrative changing? We also know that the continent's, the gains, the success stories of moving up the value chain have been few and far between, and there are real challenges related to that. It is energy intensive. You need a lot of energy. You need reliable energy. We know the continent has challenges in that area. There are other issues around investment climate that have created barriers. So it's difficult, but I think it's also important to emphasize that it's not impossible and that we should keep moving towards this. And there've been some very interesting initiatives launched recently. DRC and Zambia have entered into a partnership around building a regional security chain. There's a lot of talk around developing those regional value chains, realizing also that African countries can't go it alone and can't enter into a race to the bottom in terms of building these value chains. But that also raises complicated political questions because obviously everybody wants those jobs to be created within their own borders, and South Africa would be a good case because a lot of that industrial capacity and other resources are found in the country. But for a country like DRC that at the moment is shipping its cobalt to China, if it's shipping its cobalt to South Africa, does that really change the game for the DRC and for the region more broadly? So there's going to be a need for some real innovative partnerships. I think I'm going to leave my comments there. I wanted to mention a few key initiatives and things that we're seeing happening on the ground that speak to this theme and that I think connect with the themes that both Faisal and Jan have raised. There's a lot to unpack there. I think they've both kind of hinted that these papers are touching on issues that are rapidly developing, and it's an exciting space. So I'll leave it there. I'll hand over to my colleague Dion, and then we'll take it further. The one last thing I would note, just because we have this audience here and the opportunity is, again, for those not aware of it, a small pitch, Africa Climate Summit happening next week. It is a very important forum where these discussions around not only the just transition and climate resilient development, loss and damage, these frameworks are taking place, but also through various discussions being led by the African Mineral Development Center. The critical minerals debate is very much part of the agenda in that space as well. All right, I'll hand over to Dion.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody. Great to talk to you today. Just a few words from my side. In terms of what we've been seeing happening in the critical minerals development, as well as the excellent groundwork laid by the team of researchers that developed the special issue. Another thing that's happening at this moment is the Critical Minerals Summit hosted by, I think, the South African presidency at the moment, actually running. Today is the last day, started yesterday. Interesting developments there. Let's see what kind of announcements come from those. But it is a very fast developing space, and I'm not gonna deliver a kind of a key kind of response to the papers presented, although I have noticed several similarities to our ongoing work on the research. I've been leading the past year also a project on critical minerals and the futures of critical minerals in the region, correct? And our attempt is to embed this type of thinking with long-term thinking and to really kind of challenge some of the assumptions, but also embed it with kind of this notion of anticipatory governance. So if I may just share with you one or two slides where I can just give you an idea of the work that we did, as well as showing how that now links with the wonderful work by the colleagues that attended. But just to give you a kind of idea of the project that we also still running, and that this project will be launched by the end of September. This project has been kind of really also building on work by Melanie and her team, but also trying to kind of embed this idea of anticipatory governance with the key focus here on exploring the high impact key uncertainties emerging from the globally transitioning commodity and energy ecosystems over the long term. Our key stakeholders here are beneficiaries of the African Minerals Development Center and the Mining Industry Association of Southern Africa. A few others, of course, governments. We've been engaging through a series of learning by doing workshops with several stakeholders. Some of you attending might have attended some of these workshops. But we've run futures literacy labs and systemic innovation workshops on the critical minerals issue, especially looking to the future. We've run policy dialogues to kind of check and whether the policy recommendations and strategic framework we developed are in line. And we've developed draft priorities, draft strategic framework and activities. Just to give you a bit of an overview of our draft strategic priorities for the futures of critical minerals in the region. This is again a 10 to 30-year look of where we need to go and what we need to attend to as an urgent priority. First is to invest and develop advanced geological surveying capacities. We see there's a huge lack of knowledge and capabilities in this area, although there's some strong pockets in South Africa and a few other countries. There's a massive need for investment in training, upskilling, as well as creation of even a regional body of geological surveying capacities that can coordinate, harmonize, and respond to the massive need to know not only what's under the ground, but what to do and how to make use of this in the most proficient way possible. The second draft priority we're also looking at is build on some of the key ideas shared in these papers, is to build on the and to capacitate mineral stewardship. There's a massive need for building competencies in mineral stewardship, which is a whole field on itself, and to build towards this new idea that we are proposing. A long-term kind of idea is the new paradigm. It's a resource balanced economy that we are proposing with this work. And this resource balanced economy is basically an advanced version that overcomes some of the shortcomings of the circular economy in mining. Then the third point we'd like to just point out to and as strategic priority is the investment and development of critical minerals and regional value chains. I'm not going to go into all of that. I think this has been discussed in detail already. But we then go into kind of the granularities of who needs to do what in terms of the strategic framework. In our draft recommendations and activities, we encourage all stakeholders as well as those listening in to engage with this document. It's going to be an open document, and to take the work further and to reach out to us if you'd like to contribute to developing the draft priorities and strategic activities. Then we also have the strong focus on embedding anticipatory governance. We see that most of our government responses and regional responses are normally reactive to changes in the environment. And we are embedding anticipatory governance as a way of embedding futures thinking, meaning you are applying strategic foresight to all your thinking about developments, uncertainties, as well as complexities in the environment, and then embedding that type of thinking into governance structures, whether that's in the public or private sectors, to improve long-termism. And to overcome the issues of short-termism and short-term gains. When you think about mining, you need to embed that type of thinking into the entire process. And then the last one that we focus on is this idea of strengthening just general governance structures through regulatory frameworks and transparency initiatives. So I think the journal articles also point to the need for those. There's an urgent need to develop a country critical mineral strategies. Some has been announced, but very few actual Southern African countries already have some form of strategy in place, as well as the regional strategies. We've got an African-wide one, but there's a need to build also on current policy documents like the African Mining Vision, as well as various other commitments made by regional member states in Southern Africa already in terms of mining, like the SADC Mining Protocol and the others, to implement those in their daily ongoings. So I'm not going to go into much more depth here. I think that just to have described some of the work. The work will be launched at the end of September. I think it strongly aligns to what I heard Faisal talking about in terms of regional, development of this regionalization notion. I think the work will complement that as well. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'll hand back to Martha.
Thanks very much, Dion. That is a good overview of that program. I've also pasted in the Q&A box a link to your Green Hydrogen, the UK Pact series, because there was a question on that. So maybe you could look at the Q&A. It's under answered questions, but you might have more to say about that. I'd like to, Alex, unless you have anything else you wanted to add before we turn to Q&A, we have a couple of minutes.
No, I think we can move to Q&A.
Okay, great. It's always better to give more time. So at this point, I would like to encourage participants who have not already posted questions in either the chat box, and I'm not seeing a lot of questions coming in through there, or through the Q&A. Then I will, at this moment, I also need to remind you that we would very much appreciate you completing our survey or the evaluation form, and Sarasa has kindly posted the link in the chat box. So if you can keep track of that, we would very much appreciate feedback on the discussions and in general on the event. All right, so with that in mind, I will and Melanie, please feel free also to note questions that come in, and you can help us distribute to the correct. There has already been one question specific to Faisal, so I will just read that out. Question for Professor Ismail: what is the risk of the WTO appellate body crisis dragging on and leading to a full-blown green trade war? Would you like to answer that for us?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I could talk for a few hours about this, but you're quite right. That's why I did go after a few years. I did go to Geneva last year to the WTO Public Forum, and I will be there again next month in September. So what was interesting about this was that for the first time, there was a big discussion in the public forum, and also reflecting the discussion taking place in the WTO on the need for the WTO to find a way of addressing trade and climate change in the WTO rules. So as you know, there is no specific mandate in the WTO on climate change. There is a mandate on environment, and there is a negotiation ongoing, which is not succeeding, except that on some issues they've made a little bit of progress. They've made some progress on issues related to subsidies and fishing at the last WTO conference, which is good. But there's still a number of other outstanding issues on the environment, on goods and services trade, for example. There's been no progress. But the context of this is that, since the Obama administration, actually, the WTO has been in crisis. And the Trump administration just deepened the crisis. He made a lot of noise about trade and the WTO. But the Biden administration has not actually improved the situation substantively, although, he's much more of a diplomat in the WTO. But substantively, the position remains the same. In other words, the United States has continued to veto the appointment of new appellate body members, which means that the WTO appellate body at the moment is dysfunctional. It doesn't work. So, you can start a complaint and you can take it up to a panel stage, but then you can't take it further to the appellate stage for adjudication, and therefore, issues are not resolved and finalized in the WTO. So, in other words, the WTO, the judicial part of the WTO is broken. The system is broken. It doesn't work. by design, and the main actor here is the United States of America, because the Europeans don't agree with it, and neither does anybody else, actually. It's the United States alone on this issue. And so the Biden administration, they just didn't do enough. But in the meantime, disputes have been growing. During the whole Trump administration, they've just been piling up on tons of unilateral actions taken by the United States, for example, on steel and aluminum. And then on climate change, several governments have been acting unilaterally. Of course, China has been doing this for a long time, but then, of course, even India, Indonesia, there was a dispute that came up, from Indonesia, but of course, there's no appellate body, so it couldn't get resolved. And in the EU now, with the CBAM and several other, subsidy programs that are now in place, and the US last year, it's like a nuclear bomb, really, because if you take the different pieces of legislation, the Infrastructure Act, the minerals, the Chips and Science Act, which is about computer chips, and the IRA, the so-called IRA, which is supposed to be about inflation, but actually it's all about green manufacturing and the new technologies and subsidies for them. And it's the biggest, the estimates are anything between sort of, the actual amounts are about $400 billion, in the IRA, and then another sort of 200 or so in the CHIPS Act. And then if you leverage all of that, you come to like about $2 trillion that could be leveraged if you leverage it, bringing the private sector in to subsidize US business. And of course, everybody in the world is impacted by that, starting with the Europeans. So the dispute with the EU is not resolved, but because EU companies have immediately been impacted. Some from Germany have moved back to the US, and more are going to go back. And I don't think the Europeans will resolve it with the US. So yes, you're quite right. I think that we do have a crisis of global trade governance. And
thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fasel. We do have a few more questions coming in. We had one directed to Jan Ickler. We have, and just to know that you're next, but I wanted, perhaps Melanie, you could give us an idea. Adrian Joseph asks, how should an African critical mineral strategy differ from national strategies already developed by those countries in the MSP? And are the authors concerned about the resurgence of resource nationalism in the form of export bans? So maybe you could direct that question to somebody while Jan takes the question that's come in, especially for him, from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, thanks so much also for the comments by Dion and Alex. Maybe I want, if we have time in the end, I want to maybe comment the comments. Because a lot of interesting ideas. But first of all, the question regarding the national referenda in Ecuador, halting mining projects and halting oil drilling in the Yasuni National Park, and if it makes a shift regarding biodiversity, environmental protection, and the role of rent. Maybe for those who don't know, the halting of oil extraction in the Yasuni National Park has been an ongoing project, or has been an idea proposed first in 2007, I think, and has been national policy under the government of Rafael Correa, at least for some time. And the idea was to stop drilling for oil in one of the most dense biosphere regions in the world. For international compensation. So it's not receiving the rent by extracting the oil, but receiving some kind of rent by international compensation. So they urged the international community to pay for, I think 60% for the oil price, what's on the ground, to pay to Ecuador. And this has been dismantled by the Correa administration later, and they choose to start oil drilling in the national park, and then it has been put on the agenda by indigenous movements and also environmentalists, and it created a really interesting political sphere in which different parties, so the supposed left-wing party, were against stopping the oil drilling because they planned with the rents. The more conservative fractions basically agreed with the indigenous perspective on that. So it's really interesting that there's a whole new political sphere developing. And now the populace basically voted yes, we have to stop oil drilling in the Yasuní National Park. And the Ecuadorian government 1 week later said, no, we will continue. Which is, I think there's a lot of tension there. I would say it makes a difference, and it makes a difference in the way that how political interests in the social groups are articulated. And we see that it makes an impact because the government talks about it, even if they are detached from big strata of the society because they have the rent to do so. As it is in the Middle East, for example, there is still pressure from below, so to say, and pressure from different parts of the population. Regarding rent, it's pretty obvious. The mining is projected to be the second biggest export branch in Ecuador in the next 5 years. So the Ecuadorian state basically put mining second after oil. And the halting of all mining projects in the Andean region would basically destroy this plan. So this would also turn out to be diminishing rents for the future. And the problem, and this maybe has not become clear from my presentation, is that there's a balance. Because at different interests, there's the urban middle classes, lower classes that need money, that don't have jobs, they have suffered from COVID. There's a violence crisis in Ecuador right now, and we have the indigenous interests, and they politically engage with each other, and the state has to balance it in a way, or the government has to balance it to be in power. So yes, it changes definitely the landscape. As I would say, it's a major win for environmentalist groups all over the world, because it gives them, in a transnational network, it gives them credibility, and they can use it as an example to connect, and they do connect, and they, I think they're broad networks all over the world where different people, also from Latin America, engaged in. So this is a major win for environmentalists, I would say, on a global scale. I don't see it as a role model for other, or it could be a role model, but I don't see it, it's not realistic in a way. And this would connect back to the things Alex said and Faisal as well. I would say there is the urge, there's a demand on the world market for critical minerals, for new minerals, but also for oil still, that it drives in a way the local or the national configurations of resource exporting states, and even maybe the competition between different resource exporting states and so on. So I don't know if this is, I think it's a really interesting, fruitful idea, and it changes the political sphere and the political talking about this. But I actually would be rather pessimistic in a way, because I see that the economic demands and structures and things are more determining, maybe. Thanks for the question.
Thanks very much. I've been monitoring questions as well. If I look distracted, I am listening. I would like to hand over to Melanie, who has volunteered to answer the question on critical minerals and this idea of the nationalism reasserting itself.
Yes, thank you. I'm also not distracted, but coordinating with other authors on who is going to respond. Maybe before I talk about resource nationalism, I think it makes sense to maybe take a step back, and it relates a bit to what Faisal said about the disputes within the WTO between Europe and the US. And I think these are some kind of disputes that we see in other areas as well, because while we tend to speak about the global north or the west, however you want to call it, I think also with regard to mineral supply chain and also the coordination within the MSP, my impression is not that the US and the EU necessarily pursue a similar approach, and that they're also, and they are also competitors. So I think if you look at the IRA, and I also always wonder about the inflation, because it's where does that come from? It's really, like you said, Faisal, it's a lot of investment to bringing back industries or maybe relocating industries. And as you said, there were just some German companies who went to the US who were supposed to start producing in Germany. So this is where a lot of the competition happens. And I think even though these countries partner within the MSP, you also have bilateral mineral relationship that the US is offering for African countries, that the EU is offering for African countries. But then even within the EU, you have bilateral mineral resource partnerships that different European countries are offering. So this is also quite confusing, I think. But it is happening, and I think it has to do with the fact that also even within the EU, countries are competing with each other. So, for example, Germany is a need for minerals for the production of cars, electronic vehicles, and different types of machines. France needs similar minerals and metals for different sectors. So I think it is also really important to understand that there is some kind of competition going on between these countries that we also need to take into account. And that brings me to the question of resource nationalism, because I'm struggling a bit with that term. I know it's been used quite often, but one could also say it's within this type of environment, it's a legitimate means of or approach of certain African countries to say, okay, if that is going to happen, we also need to protect our mineral sector. We also need to protect our own interests in a way. And maybe focus a bit more on our own industrial policies, on the development of natural resources. So I know this term is often used in a very negative way, but I don't necessarily see why that differs from industrial policy approaches that other countries are pursuing. Finally, the question to me is, where does that lead us to? Because are we entering a phase where there is a lot of competition between actors everywhere, which could eventually also lead to a lot of competition between countries on the African continent? This in a way contradicts regional cooperation in a way. And it also challenges this transnational or globalized model that we had in the past, let's say 30 years. So this for me is the question. And I think while there's so much competition and geopolitical competition, overall the question is, what about cooperation? And this is where I think just introducing barriers and strong industrial policies and following a very nationalist approach with regard to the development of natural resources can also be tricky and maybe contradictory to the aim that these countries would like to achieve. This is why I think strategies developed by the African Union, also by regional economic communities such as SADC, ECOWAS, this is to me a more promising approach. And by the way, since we're advising German political decision makers, I say exactly the same thing to German political decision makers with regard to a European strategy, so that regional cooperation is important and maybe more fruitful. But of course, we can't be naive. eventually, and I think Faisal, you said it, or no, Alex, you said it, it comes down to, you know, developing jobs for local economies. And this is maybe one of the big issues, and maybe the balancing act that countries have to do.
Thank you. I was muted. I have a question that is in the open section of Q&A that I would like to throw open to whomever perhaps has insight into the Convention on Biological Diversity. And that is, how have these developments in green mineral strategies taken other critical frameworks into account, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity? I don't know if any of the authors have an expertise in that convention, or perhaps Alex, anyone?
Yeah, I'll say something briefly about that. In fact, I wanted to respond to that and the reference to resource nationalism, and I think it'll largely echo what Melanie said on resource nationalism, but my sense is certainly we've got to pay careful attention to who is using this term and in what sense the term is being used. Because certainly there's, I think we've got to concede that any government has certain policy levers. There are carrots and there are sticks at their disposal. And recognizing that, you know, all countries are using industrial, trade, and other policies and regulations to also pursue their interests. So certainly, you know, that's not to say that there aren't any concerns around things like export bans and, you know, very uneven or unpredictable tax regimes or royalty regimes when it comes to minerals. But, you know, if anything that prevents the ongoing flow of unprocessed minerals from Africa to elsewhere in the globe is going to be labeled resource nationalism, you can understand how African stakeholders themselves are going to have a real problem with that. So I think the term itself is problematic, and that you know, there's a lot that needs to be unpacked there. In fact, it's a label that really doesn't help the debate around Africa and other regions, including Latin America, trying to be more assertive about moving out of this position they've found themselves in within global mineral value chains. Then on the global biodiversity framework, maybe I won't answer this question directly, but I think there is something that is important worth saying on that, and that is we are aware that mining has negative social impacts, it has negative environmental impacts. A big aspect of the Global Biodiversity Agreement is to restore ecosystems and to increase the areas, both terrestrial and marine, that is under protection. You know, the 30 by 30 target. Now, we know that mining in protected areas, and this is something that came up in Jan's paper, but in Africa as well, mining in protected areas is a major problem. And social and environmental sustainability issues is a major problem. Now, there's been a trend that we're picking up in media and some analysis around the critical minerals debate that refers to the social and environmental negative impacts of mining, looking at things like cobalt mining in the DRC, looking at things like lithium mining in Zimbabwe. And the narrative then becomes, well, you see, these green industries, renewable energies, solar power, electric vehicles, and so forth, are driving increasing mining activity, and this is having terrible social and environmental consequences in the developing world and elsewhere, and then presenting this as a kind of false equivalency of, you know, fossil fuels might be dirty, but actually so is renewable energy. And I think we have to engage with that debate. And the argument is certainly that there remains a real imperative for environmentally and socially responsible mining. But I think that this idea of an equivalence between fossil fuel industries and fossil fuel derived energy and renewable energies is something that we should I would say flat out really reject. There is space to build out the capacity for renewable energies to address the very real need for a transition, while at the same time working towards more socially and more environmentally responsible mining. I don't think that this is a real choice, or it's, shall we say, a false choice being presented to us, that we should either continue with fossil fuel-based energies, or we should accept the environmental and social harm that is associated with mining in some jurisdictions.
May I quickly jump in? Okay, just on the biodiversity issue. Sorry, Jan, I'm not sure if you also would like to address that. But I think there are two issues. One is we conducted many interviews with mining companies for our project. So Svenja, Michael, also another colleague, Christina, and I. And I think when you look at environmental issues, I think a huge priority of mining companies is on the reduction of CO2 emissions. And I would say it's not so much on biodiversity in a broader sense, such as, you know, protecting the environment, water quality, but also wildlife and so on. What concerns me a bit, that if you look at the Critical Raw Materials Act that the EU is introducing, there is a section on, I mean, it's still a draft, but I mean, there is a section on not necessarily lowering standards, but also circumventing. I think my colleague Inga could explain it a bit better, but like circumventing certain environmental procedures when looking at mining in the EU. So I think the assumption is the environmental standards in the EU are so high, so the EU is not competitive. We need to, you know, not take it too seriously anymore. I'm exaggerating a bit, to be competitive and to start or restart mining within the EU. And I think this is exactly the opposite what is needed. So we don't need we need a race to the top with regard to environmental standards, also with regard to biodiversity, and not a race to the bottom. But I'm a bit concerned that this is happening at the moment. And I think this is where the biodiversity convention comes in, which I think receives much more, deserves much more attention, and maybe also receives a bit more attention at the moment. But for me, this is an area for research that you know, critical researchers need to investigate, because I think there is some kind of greenwashing happening with, okay, we lower our CO2 emissions because we introduce renewables into climate, you know, with climate smart mining and so on. But these biodiversity issues are sometimes neglected. So I think this is an area that deserves much more attention also from a research perspective.
Thank you, Melanie. Jan Ickler has a point to make on this biodiversity convention.
No, I wanted to go back to the resource nationalism.
Okay.
Just one thing, although the biodiversity point is also really interesting in Ecuador as well, it's like the political wish and the institutional setting is one thing and the practice is another, which is also like a problem of liability issues. That might be interesting, but I wanted to go back to the resource nationalism. And I basically agree with everything Alex said. It's really interesting because I think in Latin America, especially in the last 20 years, this debate has been discussed a lot. And in Ecuador had like 99% extra profit tax on oil. So everything that exceeds a certain point is taxed 99%, which is basically resource nationalism, which is not like we use the oil for ourselves, we don't refine it, whatever, but we basically take the most important, the highest tax we can on exceeding profits from mining corporations, and this was rightly. In certain debates, rightly renowned for giving the possibilities for development. And I think this is pretty important when we talk about these development issues. It's always, for me, it's like since the 70s, it's about prices. So we want critical minerals have to be exported, yes, but at what price? So different negotiators talk about the prices of these minerals. Of course, the consumer nations want to pay less. Of course, the exporter nations want to pay more. And basically, it's a price issue. And the way is how can we get as much out of these of selling, exporting critical minerals or whatever. The other thing that's much more important is basically what Alex said is what do these countries do with these things? In what institutional setting, in what technological setting, in what social setting these countries operate in exporting critical minerals? And this is a question that academia as well as policymakers have to answer in the next years, because I think this is the money, basically, the money part, the finance part is there, but what actually is done? And this also creates social pressures from different target groups. And this is what I may want to end on is these are developing nations or poor nations or whatever framework you want to use. There are many people that might not really care so much about critical minerals, but more what they want to eat in the next 24 hours or whatever. And this is a political issue that is interacting. And the development regimes we put in the north, from Germany, whatever, also have to deal with this issue. And I think it's sometimes difficult to tear it apart.
Thanks very much, Jan. There has been a question besides the open question in the Q&A box responding to Alex. I wanted to ask Dion, but I'm not sure if we still have Dion able to address this. So Fazelle, this might be something you could help us look at. Okay, Dion is back. I'll read it. Given that South Africa possesses 80% of the world's platinum group metals and 40% of the world's platinum and palladium supplies, which are key components for GH2, which I believe is green hydrogen production, should Africa's most industrialized nation, i.e. South Africa, I'm assuming, expect to play a more meaningful role further downstream in the nascent green hydrogen global value chain? So I don't know, this, we only have a couple more minutes, so I'd appreciate input on this question. Either, Dion, do you want to take a few minutes?
I'm just going to quickly respond. Sorry about the title, and over to you as well. Just in terms of our research on green hydrogen for South Africa, we did a project oriented to the skills and TVET college needs, that is the technical vocational training needs for Southern Africa by, say, 2030 to 2050, and what we need to anticipate. But we looked in depth at, how the Hydrogen Society roadmap for South Africa was structured and what the implications are for job creation and also in those. But in answering his question, I think the key challenge is for government to move more at speed. Generally, you see massive interest from Europe, especially, but also some other global south countries and global north interested in the export of green hydrogen to these countries. The question is in what way we can respond fast enough to address this, and do we, the government, can create the necessary vehicles or structures within itself to formulate kind of what I propose, a kind of a COVID task response, crisis response team to find a way to move more quickly in creating these hybrid structures to make decisions faster in an interdepartmental way that might facilitate these important discussions. The same could be said for the critical minerals discussion as well. But on hydrogen and green hydrogen, there's no current project, even in South Africa, where many other countries are having real momentum. And while we are talking a lot about Buchu Bay and the creation of a new harbor, there's also the Hydrogen Valley. There's more speed is required. And with that, I hand over to Faisal. Thank you.
Yeah, just perhaps I can just say one word on this before I also need to jump off in a minute. I think that you're quite right, Dion. I agree. And linking up, I think, with Jan Eckler's point, and the key question here is that who gets the rent? And the second point is how do we ensure that as we build these renewable energy capabilities in our countries and export these renewables, how do we ensure that we get as much of the value from the value chain as we can and transfer those rents for developmental purposes? That's really the key question. And I think that for the North, this is the most sustainable way of building partnerships. So, ensure that there's much, and ensure that the local communities are the ones that make the most gains, so that, they support, and otherwise you have situations like the Mozambique, situation where the local communities are marginalized, and then you have a potential for resentment, marginalization, conflict, and all kinds of other forces coming in, and national security problems flowing from that. So, and I think that, there's nationalism everywhere. United States of America, made in Great Britain, and of course, across the developing world as well. We've seen that in Brazil recently, South Africa to some extent in a few quarters. And we see that everywhere. And the question for us is, how do we turn this sort of narrative towards a debate which really grapples with the key issue we're trying to deal with, which is the sustainability of the planet and the human beings who live in it, and the new relationship between man and nature. And that really should be at the core of the debate, and how we build, a real just transition, which really pays attention to an equitable and fair distribution. There are new technologies that can help all of us transition to a low carbon economy, but how we transition and who gains from that transition is critical. Otherwise, it won't be sustainable anyway, and then it will be a recipe for conflict. So I want to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a very good note to draw together the sort of big picture of what this issue was really trying to grapple with. I would like to close off. We are just on time. So if I could hand over to Melanie, I don't know if you want to say anything in closing at this point. Just acknowledging Micah and Svenja, I will also say I appreciated working with you as a team of guest editors. You were a great pleasure to work with. And I would like to say thank you to Bui, my assistant editor, who has been busy behind the scenes in many unseen but greatly appreciated ways.
Thank you so much, Martha. I can give this positive feedback, or return the positive feedback back to Saya. It was really a pleasure. It was also a real pleasure working with the authors, and I'm very happy with the papers that we got. I think I had written down a few areas for further, research, cooperation, collaboration, or maybe things that that should be taken into account. But I think we mentioned most of it, like, the development of industrial policies, regional economic initiatives, competition between certain countries. But maybe I think the most important aspect is, and I think this webinar brings this to light again, the importance of cross-regional cooperation, cooperation and also research cooperation between countries from Latin America, or perspectives from Latin America and Africa, but also from Europe and Africa. I think this is really valuable because it's a fast-moving target. I think we were a bit brave to do a special issue on something that is moving so rapidly, so quickly, and I'm pretty sure we would have all written our articles a bit differently if we would start again. But I think this is something that we should really continue doing, and I hope and I'm sure this won't be the last collaboration between SWP and SAIA, and hopefully from our team as well.
I see Martha's screen is frozen. Martha, Martha, you're back.
Yes, I'm back. I thank you. I don't know if that was load shedding somewhere in the country, but I've got power. So thank you, Melanie, for those words. I'm sorry if I missed the last few. I think I will draw the discussion to a close. The last point I'll make is that 4 of the articles are free to view, and therefore you can share them widely, even outside of the academic community where many people would be able to read the issue. Those are the papers represented here. Melanie's paper on geopolitics is actually open access into the future. Jan and Fazel's paper, and also the paper by Salam Fakir, is free access to the end of September. So I would encourage you to share widely. Those papers can be downloaded and read in the future. Thank you very much to all the participants today, both the guest editors, the authors, and also the SAIA team. We appreciate it, and we hope this issue will spark more discussions elsewhere. On that note, I'll say thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, I think we close. Thank you, Jan. Hoffentlich sehen wir uns mal in Deutschland.
Ja, hoffentlich. Gerne. Ciao, ciao.
Mach's gut, ciao.